From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Friday, May 29th, 2015. Section 215 of the USA Patriot Act is expiring, sending lawmakers and the Obama administration scrambling to preserve the government's desire to spy on us. We'll turn to journalist Marcy Wheeler for more. And we'll go to Santa Barbara, California, where a massive oil pipeline spill on the beach has residents reeling and activists up in arms. Rebecca Claassen of Food and Water Watch will join us. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan, Assistant Professor of Journalism Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
An international meeting took place in Bangkok earlier today to discuss the crisis of Rohingya refugees. The Rohingya are a Muslim minority from Myanmar who have been escaping persecution only to risk their lives at sea as they attempt to reach Malaysia and other nations. Representatives from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, met with officials from the US, Switzerland, and the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. The Myanmar government threatened to boycott the talks if the word Rohingya was used, but attended in the end. Responding to criticism, Myanmar's representatives U Tin Lin refused to accept responsibility and accused the attendees of singling out his country. Meanwhile, members of ASEAN agreed to increase efforts to search and rescue the thousands of migrants still stranded at sea. Myanmar announced that its navy had seized a boat with 700 people on board. Well, Cristina, can international pressure force Myanmar to improve conditions for its Rohingya population, a people that it refuses to even name?
Yeah, I think historically speaking, international pressure has often influenced the domestic politics of a nation. Anytime mistreatment and discrimination, and as you just mentioned, the non-naming of an entire group of people and rejecting basically citizenship status, right? We're talking about thousands of people, has been brought into international spotlight. There's always going to be more pressure for political officials to act. But it's important to understand that, of course, for political officials to act, they have to feel like there are going to be political and economic interests at stake because they want to, so often nation states want to brand themselves, right? And so international pressure is really important. And I think we can learn lessons from U.S. discussions about immigration reform as well as Western Europe's recent responses to their issues with immigration as well, and hope that if we continue to pressure the government of Myanmar, that maybe there will be responses to addressing this issue.
And then ISIS has claimed responsibility for bombing in Saudi Arabia that killed 3 people. The attack took place in the parking lot of a Shia mosque earlier today when a suicide bomber dressed as a woman was thwarted from entering the building. The incident comes a week after a deadly attack killed 21 people and injured nearly 100 at another mosque. ISIS appears to be trying to foment violence between Saudi Arabia's Sunni and Shia populations in an effort to destabilize the monarchy. The situation is ironic given that Saudi Arabia was one of several nations that supplied Syrian rebels with arms, many of which flowed to ISIS soldiers. Cristina, is this a matter of Saudi Arabia's chickens coming home to roost?
Well, I think, it's a tragic outcome. Again, there are lessons to learn when nation states intervene into the politics of others. So as we can see here is the prime example that the U.S. is not the only nation that isn't immune to the consequences of foreign policy. And we also have to put into context that, Saudi Arabia's close political ties with U.S. interests also need to be accounted for. For instance, the ongoing cooperation between these two countries on maintaining what they would call regional stability, regulating the international oil market, continuing this so-called war on terror, right? I mean, this is really an important conversation when it comes to the emergence of ISIS in the Middle East. Continuing that conversation really illustrates Saudi Arabia has served as a puppet for the United States. And so, of course, there are going to be consequences, albeit tragic ones.
And finally, here in the United States, the ACLU has just released a report on policing in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The report analyzed arrest records obtained by the civil liberties group over a 2-year period. It found that African Americans were nearly 9 times more likely to be arrested for low-level offenses than whites. A similar statistic emerged for Native Americans. A whopping 40% of all arrests were of young people violating curfew. Minneapolis requires teens between 15 and 17 years of age to be indoors past 11 p.m., but 56% of those arrested for curfew violations were of black teens. The report emerged after a high-profile case came to light of 4 youth of Somali descent who were pulled over by a cop on suspicion of driving a stolen car. The car was legally theirs. A video of the encounter revealed the officer in question threatening to break the teenagers' legs and justifying the arrest just because, quote, "I feel like arresting you." Cristina, certainly no one can be surprised by the results of the study, but can such studies be a first step in addressing such policing disparities?
Yeah, well, I think first the discussion of disparities allows us to re-examine the legal system in this country. And this article, along with the hundreds of other articles we've seen come out in the past year or so, I think understanding that this isn't really a justice system, but one that continues to discipline and regulate brown bodies, brown and black bodies, that is the first step, right? And so I think now there's a question of where do we go from here? Where do we go from a conversation about these disparities? And some might say that my answer is impossible or so-called radical, but I really think the way that we can start addressing these disparities is really by dismantling the system, rethinking and coming up with alternative ways of creating a real justice system that reflects the so-called democracy that we supposedly live in. And for this country, that's pretty revolutionary. And I think so we'll have to continue to call not for reform, but transformation, one that focuses on dismantling white supremacy.
Cristina Mislan, I always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you next week. Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A section of the USA Patriot Act expires on Sunday, and lawmakers still haven't decided what, if anything, to do about it. Section 215, according to The Hill, quote, has been used by law enforcement almost 200 times per year to collect bank and business records from suspected terrorists and spies. But privacy advocates have long denounced the invasive nature of the law into the lives of innocent and ordinary Americans. The USA Freedom Act was intended to address some of the concerns, but activists celebrated when the Senate failed to pass it on a procedural vote. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has scheduled a rare Sunday vote on the measure to try to pass it once more, and the House already passed the bill. The Senate will also consider a bill introduced by Senator Dianne Feinstein, who has been a strong proponent of the government's right to spy on Americans. Feinstein's bill criminalizes whistleblowers and is being likened to the Espionage Act. Meanwhile, the Obama administration, panicking at the idea that it might lose some legal justification for mass surveillance, accused lawmakers of playing, quote, national security Russian roulette with the Patriot Act. My guest is Marcy Wheeler. She is a journalist specializing in national security issues, the war on terror, and civil liberties. She has a column on exposefacts.org called Right to Know. Welcome to the show, Marcy.
Thanks for having me.
So what exactly has Section 215 enabled the government to do, and why is that section sunsetting now, but not the entire Patriot Act?
So when it was instituted, it was a new thing, and Congress was worried it could be used to get things like library records, which it can, with some special reporting requirements. And so they included a sunset on it just so that Congress could review it from time to time to make sure it hadn't been abused. There are actually 3 things that are expiring on Monday, and that's just one of them. But people know it best as the authorization for the phone dragnet, for the government's effort to collect every single American's phone records, the records of who they call, when, how long they're on the phone, what handset they use when they do it. And that's been in place since 2006. But the Hill piece that you quoted actually is misleading, because the most common use of it now, in addition to this phone dragnet, is to collect fairly bulky internet collections. So it might be that it is collecting the records of anybody coming into or out of a frequent cyber attack target, including innocent people. It might be collecting the records of a particular internet service provider. So so it's collecting everybody's phone records, or at least everybody's landline and anything that crosses AT&T's backbone. But it's also being used for, I mean, the most of what it's used for is actually very bulky collection. And so it picks up the records of completely innocent people and leaves them in NSA, or more often FBI's databases, for up to 30 years.
So what you're saying is that even though this section specifically is authorizes phone data collection, it is actually being used to look at internet information as well by searching the phone records of ISPs?
No, of going to the ISP and saying, give us your logs of everybody who's been visiting this website, or and that's what we believe they're doing, is they're getting data flow, log records. So it is fairly bulky and significant records of the internet activities at particular corners of the internet, if that makes sense.
So are the Obama administration's words on national security Russian roulette a little over the top?
The Russian roulette. Look, the phone dragnet has proved not very useful at all. It's never found a terrorist. The only thing that it purportedly has been a part of is finding a guy who sent $8,500 to al-Shabaab, and not even because he supported terrorists. He was trying to fight back against the Kenyan invasion of Somalia. So that's all it's been good for since 2006.
Wow.
I do suspect that this internet collection is much more valuable to the government, but that stuff is not going to expire right on Sunday. That stuff, it'll have different expiration dates. We won't know when those are, but that's going to continue for a while.
And the ACLU's Jamil Jafar said that the claim that the expiration of Section 215 would deprive the government of necessary investigative tools or compromise national security is entirely without support. So I think you likely agree with him on that.
I mostly agree. I mean, I think that if the government would let themselves be honest rather than this ridiculous veil of secrecy, they might actually be able to point to some uses of that internet function, which they've only done since 2009. But hey, they won't let themselves be honest. So I'm with Jamil. Until they can give us a concrete explanation of what the use of it is, I'm just going to assume that it's not all that useful.
Now, the Justice Department released a report last week on the effectiveness of Section 215, and analysts say that it actually contradicts the Attorney General's claims about the Patriot Act. Is that true?
Again, that report, the use of Section 215 that report investigates only goes through 2009, so it doesn't include this internet stuff.
Right.
So what we can conclude is that all of the other uses, so the phone dragnet, there's also, by the way, and this is important, it did and may still authorize Section 215, that is, the collection of all of the international money transfer records for Western Union. So if people have family overseas and they're sending money via Western Union, they're being sucked up, or they at least were being sucked up in this dragnet, which is something CIA runs under the program. And again, that's another example of lots of innocent people who will be affected by these bulkier programs, and we don't know whether that money transfer, that Western Union dragnet is still in existence, but we don't know. It's that showed up in the IG report, and that apparently wasn't all that useful either. So,
well, a newly confirmed Attorney General Loretta Lynch said that if Section 215 expires, quote, we lose important tools. I think that we lose the ability to intercept these communications, which have proven very important in cases that we have built in the past. Do we know what she's talking about, or is it just that she's trying to get us to take her word for it because they're not necessarily giving us all the data?
Right, and she was talking about that Section 215 and the two other expiring provisions. And her use of the word intercept is really funny because under Section 215, they're not allowed to intercept any communications. So it's unclear what she meant by that. But just as an example, one of the other expiring provisions is called the roving wiretap provision, and that allows them, say they're going to wiretap me. Every time I get a new phone, they can move their wiretap to that new phone based on the original order against me. But we also know that that provision is one that the FISA court has secretly redefined back in 2007, such that they said, okay, you can agree to wiretap Al-Qaeda, which is this kind of amorphous group that might include 70 people and might include 6,000. And anytime you come up with a number that you want to wiretap under the name of wiretapping Al-Qaeda, we'll approve it. And so that one too, and that may be what Attorney General Lynch meant when she said intercept. But everyone keeps saying, well, that's a non-controversial authority. And in my mind, once the FISA court has redefined these words in secret, and we know they have with this one, then it's controversial. Then I find it controversial, and we shouldn't just assume that they haven't reinvented it further to conduct more wiretapping in the United States under some crazy provision.
So let's talk about the fact that there have been some efforts to try to address the problems with Section 215 and, of course, with surveillance in general. There is still the USA Freedom Act that the House passed that I believe was initially supported in its earlier forms by privacy advocates. It did not survive a procedural vote in the Senate, and it's going to be raised again on Sunday. What does the USA Freedom Act do, and is it just that it's so watered down now that people aren't supporting it? Privacy advocates aren't supporting it?
A lot of privacy advocates are. There's a split in the privacy community, and I think it's generally a respectful split, that people who are supporting it think it's a good first step, and people, I'm on this side, who aren't supporting it think that it gives away too much in an effort to get the phone records out of the hands of the government. And the good sides of it is it will shut down this phone dragnet. It won't let the government collect communications records in bulk. And by bulk, we mean all. So in other words, the government will no longer be able to go to Verizon and say, we want to collect all records that you have on all Americans. It will be able to go to Verizon and say, we want to collect all records that show this kind of behavior, or all records that we think might have some tie to Al-Qaeda. And that's one of the problems with it, is it does significantly limit the kind of communications that you can collect. It would not, for example, do anything to end that Western Union dragnet I told you about. So if that's still in place, that'll go on just like it currently is, because that kind of limiting language is tied more specifically to communications records than it is to other tangible things.
So let's talk about Senator Dianne Feinstein's offering in this debate. She proposes a way to salvage Section 215, but it, I understand, goes even further than just preserving phone surveillance powers. That actually criminalizes whistleblowers?
Right. So both Richard Burr, who is the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Dianne Feinstein, who is the ranking member, introduced bills in the last week. And Richard Burr's was sort of like the fantasy of the intelligence community. It would authorize the existing phone dragnet. It would expand it to internet records, which they've had problems getting in bulk since 2009, 2011. It would allow them to take that other internet collection I told you about and move it back to orders that don't have any kind of court review. And both of these bills, so then in response, Feinstein introduced a bill that was sort of like USA Freedom Act, but gutted some things and as you said, included this provision, which was also in Burr's bill, which basically makes it a 10-year felony to leak not just national defense information, which is what the Espionage Act prohibits, but classified information.
Wow.
So anything that has to do with the collection of these phone records going forward carries with it its very own special 10-year prison term. And you gotta wonder, I mean, why would a bill have its very own Espionage Act?
Right, and in fact, aren't they already using the Espionage Act, or I should say misusing it to persecute Edward Snowden, for example? Is this just a way of really, if anyone questions the use of the Espionage Act, putting it in its own bill?
Well, the standard is lower, for one. I mean, it just has to be classified. So basically anything that has to do with this program, they're going to say it's classified. We don't want a peep of this getting to journalists ever again. And that's actually remarkable. Richard Burr said, and this is the shtick that they're saying, they're like, excuse me, they said, well, we need to protect the providers. Every other civilized country, when they impose data retention requirements, makes it clear that every provider is subject to it. Rather than doing that, they say we want to protect providers, which, by the way, would prevent the providers from leaking details about what they're being asked to do. And one of the reasons I'm particularly concerned about this, like special Espionage Act just for the phone dragnet, for the phone records provision, is it's not entirely clear what the providers are going to be asked to do. So in other words, they're going to be asked to get records of people who are connected. And the House report on USA Freedom Act imposed some limits about what kind of connections they could make. But if those limits aren't in place, then providers could be asked to do kind of pattern analysis, which is something we know the NSA does overseas, and it's something that we know until 2009 they were doing on this phone record data. And so in cases like that, you basically would have Verizon and Apple become the paid deputies of the intelligence community, and you can see why that they would impose this Espionage Act to prevent us from learning that. So
pattern analysis, meaning basically running algorithms on data to try to catch suspicious patterns of people's phone calls?
Right. So The Intercept had an article on the way the NSA tracks co-travelers. So people carrying phones who are walking in the same place, or certain kinds of travel patterns. That has nothing to do with phone calls. It has everything to do with geolocation, right? Which our smartphones collect on us all the time by necessity. And they found, the NSA determined that based on these pattern analyses, a particular Al Jazeera journalist was a courier for Al-Qaeda. But that's the kind of thing NSA does with phone metadata overseas. They can't do it with the phone records they collect in the United States, partly because they can't get, the NSA cannot receive those location records in bulk from the telecoms, but the telecoms still have access to them. And so, under USA Freedom Act and Feinstein's bill, it is still true that the NSA could not receive location in bulk. The House bill prohibits providers from being asked to do analysis on location data, but if depending on what happens, that may go onto the cutting room floor. Just as an example, AT&T has a program called Hemisphere, and they do geolocation analysis on phone records under the drug war. So that there is precedent for a particular telecom to do this kind of analysis in records it holds but doesn't turn over to the government, and that's one of the things we should right now USA Freedom Act does not permit that. I want to be clear, but we should be vigilant against letting that happen as these bills kind of wander through both houses.
So, Marcy, what is expected to happen on Sunday? I mean, this is a very sort of last minute, last ditch effort to salvage this section of the USA Patriot Act. And some reports are emerging now that Senator Rand Paul, a libertarian Republican, might try to thwart any efforts to prolong Section 215 or preserve any of its powers. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, the only way the phone dragnet can continue and move towards this transition to where the providers will hold the records and do the analysis for the government, and that would happen in 6 months. The only way that can happen is if 3 additional senators support the USA Freedom Act, because that's already been passed by the House, and if Paul and everybody else, I mean, it could be a right-wing senator, Rand Paul is right-wing, but of a different type. It could be an authoritarian senator like Tom Cotton, who could object to moving forward without any further debate. But any senator on Sunday night, even if 3 additional senators vote to move forward to vote for USA Freedom Act, can delay the vote of it up to 30 hours, but they can't prevent the vote. And so you could see, for example, Paul being guaranteed votes on surveillance-related bills in the next week, and him agreeing to unanimous consent, and then it being voted through, and President Obama signing USA Freedom Act at midnight on Sunday. Or you could see Paul object, and you could see them vote through the USA Freedom Act on Tuesday, and it go back to the House to resuscitate the dragnet. And that might be the most likely thing, and those 2 days of dragnet lapse would not be that big of a deal. But those are the 2 most likely things to happen, but I don't think anyone really knows.
What are the odds that Feinstein's bill could be the one picked up, or is it just not enough support, you think, politically?
Well, the problem is she'd have to get it through the House, and
right.
And a lot of people, I mean, it's not just that people in the House came up with what they view as a reasonable compromise. And frankly, I mean, all of the hawks, for the most part, in the House voted for it. I think that it should be regarded as something that has a lot for the intelligence community, and that, a fair number of progressives supported. So I think you can call it a compromise, for better and worse. I think that, they may object to being asked to go back and do their hard work again just because the Senate basically turned in its homework late. I mean, one of the underlying themes that really should be brought out about this is Mitch McConnell. He's like, oh, we got to keep the country safe. We got to keep the country safe. If the dragnet lapses, it is Mitch McConnell's fault first and foremost, because he's the one who, partly to gain tactical advantage, delayed these votes until the very last minute. And so, brand new majority leader, we've got to keep the country safe. If the dragnet lapses, the person far most responsible for that is Mitch McConnell.
And is there a chance that Section 215 would just expire and be laid to rest? The New York Times today put out an op-ed essentially calling for Section 215 to simply expire.
Well, I think after Section 215 expires, there'll be a debate about what limits should be imposed on it. I think that internet stuff I talked to you about before, I think most people in government, I think it's probably bulkier than we should support. I think we should ensure that the FBI gets rid of the records it collects after it determines there's no tie to spying or terrorism. So, I think you could improve that. But I think that function will be preserved in some way or another. Another way they've used this in the past, for example, is they sometimes get explosive precursors, which also happen to be beauty supplies. I kid you not, they used it in 2009 to get acetone, large purchases, but not that large purchases of acetone and hydrogen peroxide in Aurora, Colorado, and then apparently reference those purchases to see if anybody was 2 degrees from Najib Bouazizi. And so that's the kind of thing that would be preserved as well, that they want. I bet they've used it to get pressure cookers as well in the aftermath of the marathon bombing. So that kind of function will be preserved, although I would like to see a debate about the retention of those records of people that are completely innocent, because otherwise, you know, you'll have pressure cooker owners being in an FBI database potentially implicated just because their neighbor has ties to somebody dubious overseas for 30 years. And that's, I think, another real problem.
So, Marcy, at this point, what role can ordinary Americans play in impacting and influencing this debate and this sort of high-speed dealing around these various laws and letting Section 215 expire, renewing it, etc.? Can people, are there efforts to encourage folks to contact their representatives, or are there protests planned for the Capitol on Sunday?
I would definitely, you know, if you either want these authorities to expire with the hope that people can get more leverage to negotiate better protections for Americans' privacies, or if you think USA Freedom Act is a good bill that should be the kind of last line in the sand, I would definitely encourage you to call your senator and your representative, because nothing, you know, anything except USA Freedom Act would have to go back through the House. And to the extent that people in the House are saying we're not going to water down this bill anymore, that means that USA Freedom Act is the very worst that can happen. And that does have some advantage, you know, that does have some improvements, some weak transparency, some first steps in making the FISA court more accountable. So, you know, yeah, then people should call their representatives. And there are, I mean, last week when people were at home, there were actually protests in front of senators' offices to let this stuff sunset. So,
and we didn't get a chance to talk about the Obama administration, except for the sort of hysterical-sounding language regarding
Russian roulette,
national security, Russian roulette. But is Obama, as far as you know, playing a role behind the scenes to try to arm twist lawmakers? And really, you know, one has to really wonder why the Obama administration feels that these intelligence communities and intelligence agencies need such broad powers, you know, such a large net to deal with the issue of terrorism.
Yeah, and I actually think you asked before, you know, I think the impetus for bills like Richard Burr's, the intelligence community fantasy, somebody's gotten to him and said, no, we want a bigger slice of the pie. And to Obama's credit, he's saying, no, we need a more moderate slice of the pie. I've told people that we're going to rein in this dragnet to something more reasonable. So Obama is there. The entire point of this hysterical fear-mongering is to try and raise the stakes on people like Mitch McConnell, who, again, if the dragnet lapses, he is first and foremost responsible, not Rand Paul, as people say. But to some degree, Obama, I think, could have pushed further already in trying to shut down the dragnet using other authorities. The Obama administration keeps saying, and has for years, that they can't move the records back to the telecoms unless they pass a law, and that probably means expanded immunity and compensation for the providers, and that ought to raise some questions by itself. Again, what are the providers actually being asked to do? But Obama has taken a middle ground. You know, he's not shut down the dragnet when he could have or probably should have been able to, but at the same time, he's not pushing for the Richard Burr kind of intelligence community fantasy bill.
And finally, Marcy, we talked about what people can do and how people really have also been so active for so long. And recently there was an online effort called Blackout Congress, which was an interesting effort by activists that blocked access of members of Congress to their own websites and instead redirected them to a website, blackoutcongress.org, saying, we're blocking your access until you end mass surveillance laws. I'm wondering what impact you think such efforts have. I mean, they're certainly creative.
Well, you know, it's interesting because in the last 6 months or so, since USA Freedom the last time died, I think there's a little more confidence from the privacy community that they can change the narrative on this, even with ISIS. You know, the idea is, oh my gosh, ISIS is going to go attack us in our streets. But I think that the coalition, which is really a transpartisan coalition, I mean, it unites libertarians and progressives, has gotten a bit stronger, and therefore it gotten a little bit more, I mean, a little more aggressive on insisting on real reform. And also, the Second Circuit ruled that the phone dragnet was not authorized by the law they're using, and I think that that has also made people more confident. So, the narrative is beginning to change. I think there are at least two people. One, Ron Johnson, who is going to be challenged by Russ Feingold in Wisconsin, and also Chris Van Hollen, who is facing a primary to be Senator of Maryland against Donna Edwards. And in both of those races, I think you're already seeing people making decisions with an eye towards 2016 on pro-privacy as opposed to pro-surveillance. So we're beginning to see a change.
Marcy Wheeler, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
And we'll certainly see what happens to this story in the next few days or so. My guest, Marcy Wheeler, is a journalist specializing in national security issues, the war on terror, and civil liberties. And you can read her column at exposefacts.org. It's a column entitled Right to Know. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. An 11-mile underground oil pipeline near Santa Barbara burst last week, releasing more than 100,000 gallons of crude oil into the ocean and covering a 10-square-mile slick. The spill was first detected when a woman smelled fumes and reported them, after which the Coast Guard managed to stop the flow of oil. The pipeline is operated and owned by Plains All-American Pipeline, which issued an apology and says it is working to excavate a broken section of the pipeline. Cleanup crews have been busy along the shore, sopping up oil-soaked water and sand, and the impact to wildlife has already been severe. The AP reports that, quote, 13 birds, mostly brown pelicans, and 8 marine mammals, including dolphins and sea lions, were found dead. The area that the spill occurred in is home to many species of wildlife, including whales. In 1969, an oil spill in the same area, which at that time was the largest ever such spill, helped to kickstart the local environmental movement. My guest is Rebecca Claassen. She is the Santa Barbara County organizer with Food and Water Watch, and she now joins us on the phone. Welcome to Uprising, Rebecca.
Hello there.
Thanks
Hi.
so much for joining us. Well, can you tell us how many of the beaches have been impacted and which of the beaches specifically have been impacted?
There have been many beaches impacted all up and down the coastline. Our major state beaches, Refugio and El Capitan, are both heavily impacted, as well as many beaches that were usually accessed by locals just from highway pull-offs. And now folks down in Oxnard, Hermosa Beach, Redondo Beach are finding baseball and football-sized globs of oil washing up on their beaches. So it's pretty alarming, the distance that this oil seems to be traveling.
Are such oil spills inevitable? I mean, that's a big question, because if we listen to the oil industry, the line is generally that we, have strong regulations or they rather do voluntary work to make sure that they don't violate regulations and that they just minimize risk. But you can never minimize risk to zero.
I agree with that statement. I take my clues from the industry itself. If fossil fuel companies are including spills and the costs associated with cleanup in their own budgets, it seems that the industry itself thinks that it's not a question of if, but when we are going to see spills and explosions and various types of environmental disasters from this industry. In my opinion, the only safe place for oil in 2015 is under the ground. We have pipes leaking, oil trains derailing and catching fire, exploding around the country. There doesn't seem to be
offshore oil rigs exploding.
Yes, offshore rigs exploding. We now have, so this oil that's spilled is Exxon oil. 3 of the 4 rigs that feed this pipeline are owned by Exxon. The 4th rig has a lawsuit filed against it with the federal government about that rig because they were caught fracking illegally and acidizing without proper environmental impact review. So the entire situation here is alarming. It's not just the fact that one pipeline burst.
Now, in other spills, just to stay on this particular spill for a little longer before we go to the bigger picture, there's a story that often emerges that follows a bit of a script, that there was neglect by the company involved and that a government agency that was designated to watch and make sure that safety procedures were being followed didn't do its job. Is that the sort of story that's now unfolding in this case as well?
It does seem that this pipeline company was negligent. The pipeline inspection previous to the spill showed numerous anomalies, quote unquote, is what they're calling it, within the pipe, and those problems were not addressed. They just finished excavating the section of pipe yesterday, and they're sending it to their lab for a review and diagnosis.
Oh, so that piece of pipeline has been excavated now?
Just as of yesterday. I believe it's on its way to the lab. So we should know more details soon. But, the nature of the oil we are bringing out of the ground right now, kind of post-peak oil, is heavier, it's more tar-like, and it requires a lot of dilutants or heavily corrosive chemicals to make this thick stuff flow through pipelines. So if I were Plains All American Pipeline, I might take issue with the fact that the material they're responsible for transporting nowadays is more corrosive.
So, and I understand that essentially this was crude oil, as you said, diluted, being sent to refineries in California, but the pipeline itself was sort of operating at much lower capacity than it had been designed for, and that's partly because there's a major boom in fracking shale oil, particularly in California, and I know you're quite active on that, and your organization Food and Water Watch is as well. Does that industry also pose sort of longer-term risks for the Santa Barbara area and in general in California, because fracking doesn't necessarily, it's almost like a slow-moving accident, or has the impact of a slow-moving accident or spill, right?
Absolutely. The fracking industry recently was found out to be injecting toxic wastewater through federally protected aquifers in Kern County, and hundreds of federally protected aquifers in California have now been found to have been injected with toxic wastewater from the oil industry, whether it be fracking or steam injection, which is considered to be pretty similar to fracking because they use injection pressures high enough, sometimes high enough to fracture surrounding rocks. In Santa Barbara, we definitely have a lot of this shale oil. Some people say we have more shale oil left in Santa Barbara County than any other county in the country or in the state because we have been relatively environmentally progressive over the last 40 years after the 69 oil spill and have managed to leave a lot more of it in the ground. So my understanding is that oil companies have big plans for our area, and my attempt is to kind of head off that boom and to protect our local environment from the hazards and risks of the oil industry. And, you know, statewide, there have been over 600 oil and gas pipeline leaks, spills, and ruptures in California in the last 30 years.
Wow.
50 deaths, 200 injuries, and almost $800 million in damages.
Wow, those are staggering statistics.
I would say this state has seen more than its fair share of oil-related disasters.
And I mentioned earlier the 1969 spill, the specter of which sort of hangs over this current spill. Back then, 80,000 barrels of crude, at that time the worst such oil spill in history, that really helped to kick off in part the national environmental movement. Now, on this issue of the current spill, the one that just happened last week that we're talking about, in terms of the response by the pipeline company, some in California senators, in fact, the two senators from California and other local lawmakers have been criticizing the response by the pipeline company. What sort of political actions are there?
Absolutely. So in our opinion, the response from the oil pipeline company has been slow. The spokesperson has been cavalier and the company obstructive even. They tried to deny our county supervisors access to the spill site. And it's very disappointing and infuriating that the public has been cut out of this process. We're not allowed into the press conferences. We don't feel like we have direct access to the information that we need. And community members are rising up. We've had 7 actions since the spill. Hundreds of people took to the street this past Sunday and marched up State Street with a mock pipeline, asking for more public access to the information that's being uncovered, as well as a public statement saying that they would not use dispersants on this bill, which we successfully got last Sunday, a public statement promising not to use dispersants. And we're also calling on our state leaders to put, specifically Governor Brown, to put an emergency moratorium on fracking and extreme forms of oil extraction in this state, given the fact that our infrastructure just cannot handle it.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of dispersants. In the BP oil spill in the Gulf Coast region was one where a specific chemical dispersant called Core Exit was widely used, and many scientists suggested and studies suggested that it essentially helped to disappear the oil rather than clean it up. It literally dispersed it and made it spread further, and also probably helped BP shirk some responsibility. So how important is it to prevent the use of dispersant in this particular case of the Santa Barbara spill?
We consider it absolutely critical that we avoid, or we not allow them to use dispersants in our channel, or anywhere for that matter. The dispersants, unfortunately, were used in the BP spill before the full ramifications were understood, but the human health impacts have been ongoing and severe, and it's made true environmental remediation way more difficult because of, like you said, it causes the oil to split up into smaller particles and disperse throughout the water column instead of globbing together so that we can pull it out more easily.
So what needs...
Already here we're seeing that this cleanup is going to take months, if not years. Friends of mine are divers, and they've been going down and seeing the kelp forest just covered in oil, huge globs of oil.
Right, because
those
the
are very
cleanup has been
delicate.
focused on the sand, and it's easy to scoop up, or relatively easy to scoop up, using shovels, oil that globs onto sand. But what about the oil at the bottom of on the floor of the ocean?
True, right. That's the true tragedy. I mean, the kelp forests that provide habitat for numerous species are going to suffer long term from this oil spill.
What about
and you brought up a good point about the oil on the sand is easy to clean up when it's there. I was there the first day, 3 hours after the spill, and the beach was just covered. Miles and miles of beach were covered in thick, yards of oil, and nobody cleaned it up the first at least 12 hours. I was there the following morning, and the beach looked much cleaner. And I asked the reporters who had been there overnight, and they said, nobody came to clean this up. It was the high tide that came up and pulled all the oil back out to sea. That's heartbreaking.
So literally the water sucked the oil back into it. Obviously there are tides.
Yeah, the waves pulled the oil back out.
And that should have been predictable. That should have been something, obviously, that the company in question should have known to expect.
Yep. We should have had a plan to have a massive engagement to clean up that oil as soon as it hit the shores.
So, Rebecca, what about the impact to Santa Barbara's tourism industry, to the local seafood industry? These are a lot of small businesses get impacted this way.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of our major concerns. There's a moratorium on all fishing and extraction from the seas for food purposes. The tourist industry suffered immensely over Memorial Day weekend. A lot of sea adventure companies had many cancellations, as well as our local hotels, and general tourist industry is definitely suffering and scared about the ongoing problems they're going to be facing.
Now, one of the questions that comes up, I think, in my research and thinking about this, Santa Barbara is one of the wealthier communities in California, and often we see environmental accidents happening in poor parts of the country with high racial and ethnic diversity, and Santa Barbara's who may have more political clout, more economic clout, more racial privilege. How are they, compared to the average Californian, you think, going to be able to use that clout to essentially prevent this from continuing in their part of the state?
Yeah, I mean, people with a lot of resources tend to choose to live here, and largely because of the beautiful environment and the wonderful climate that we enjoy. I think there will be, our elected officials know that Santa Barbara County priorities are largely environmental. We depend a lot on our wine industry, tourist industry, and I think that the power that we're building here, not only among the more wealthy individuals, but also the student population and just the general public, we're building a lot of power here. People are very upset and want to see something done, not only for Santa Barbara County, but for the rest of the state and world, quite frankly. There's a lot of, I'd say, a level of consciousness that leads people to think about the global picture here in Santa Barbara.
Finally, the spill came at a time when there is heightened activism around the oil industry. The Shell oil has been targeted for drilling in the Arctic with some very creative political activism. Campus activism on divestment from fossil fuels has ramped up. There was just a story about Norway, and divestment from the coal industry. Are you hopeful that there are more and more people working to stop the fossil fuel industry in its tracks?
Definitely. I think, while all oil spills are horrible, oil spills that reach our oceans are more viscerally, they induce a more visceral response for some reason. And I think people are just outraged and once again reminded that this is a dangerous industry, a rogue industry in many cases that needs to be reined in. And because we have the technologies needed to create a 100% renewable energy future, we have the capital to do it. There really are no excuses for not moving beyond fossil fuels right now. And I'm very excited to be working with students at UCSB, highly involved in the divestment the divestment efforts. They had a march yesterday protesting the oil spill and also urging the UC system to divest from fossil fuels, as many universities around the country are already doing.
So Rebecca, what needs to be done in the short term on the spill that we've been discussing? We talked about long term and the plans that you and others at Food and Water Watch have to call for a moratorium and the pressure on Jerry Brown. But in the short term, what needs to happen to clean the spill up as best as possible?
Unfortunately, it seems like it's too late to do the most effective type of cleanup. It would have been most effective to get to it right away, first night that the oil was on the beach. Now we're seeing gobs of it down in Oxnard and Hermosa Beach. It's going to take a massive effort to clean this stuff up. So volunteers are currently being trained to be able to handle this oil safely. We're going to need, hundreds of sustained volunteers to get this oil spill under control.
And can our California audience and, of course, our listeners and members of our audience throughout California join in this effort?
Yes, absolutely. I can send you the web address later, or you can direct people to End Oil Now Facebook page. That group is coordinating volunteers for the cleanup effort.
That's End Oil Now. And there's also Food and Water Watch website?
Absolutely. Food and Water Watch California Facebook page is probably the easiest way to get a hold of me and other volunteer coordinators. We're also having a major event this Sunday at De La Guerra Plaza at 1 p.m., which is our city hall, and people around the state are more than welcome to engage if they feel as outreached as we do about this spill.
And that is this Sunday. The website's Food and Water Watch's website is fwwatch.org. And there's also Facebook pages that people can search for Food and Water Watch, as well as End Oil Now. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. Best of luck to you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much for your coverage.
Rebecca Claassen is the Santa Barbara County organizer with Food and Water Watch. Before we end the show today, I want to wish a fond farewell to 3 people at KPFK Pacifica Radio, where this program is produced, who are leaving us. Interim General Manager Zuberi Fields, who was the best general manager KPFK has ever had and likely will ever have. Kevin Walker, who started out as my intern on Uprising years ago and moved on to be a producer for Sojourner Truth, and who's now moving on to go to grad school. And Uprising's very own Bipasha Shom, who also started out as my intern, went on to be assistant producer and then senior producer. We'll miss all 3 of you. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Holtz is our technical director. Kiana Turner is our audio engineer. And Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. And our theme music is by Quetzal. And by the way, do subscribe to that YouTube channel. Every subscription that we get helps us sustain the TV production of Uprising. And we're pretty much out of funds, so it's up to you now to keep this going. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you Monday.